Really, the mission of our office is to work in partnership with students to foster a positive, healthy, and equitable social experience for all of our members. And so we want to be explicit around what this is for our students, right? Students join a fraternity sorority because they want a social experience, not only here at Northwestern, but in general, right? These are social fraternity and sororities, but we want them to do that in a healthy, positive, and equitable way, right? We want them to have equitable access to the student group, which is why you'll see we have all of our councils, and we'll talk a little about what that means here represented, because we want to also always offer students the full picture of the fraternity and sorority experience to allow them to then choose what might be a good fit for them. So we have some core values here at Northwestern that we often are helping our students think about. These core values drive what we call our Standard of Excellence program. So every chapter here at Northwestern must engage in our Standard of Excellence program. And it's really helping them think about where their organization or their house or their chapter is currently, and thinking about what are some goals they want to meet by the end of their actual leadership term. And so we help them to think about those goals in the context of these core values. So they should be setting goals to one or two of these core values. And so these core values are as such, right? Wellness, accountability, chapter development, social justice, and campus and partnerships. So our community at a glance, we have, as I mentioned, 4 governing councils. And so these are student elected democratic leadership of organizations that help manage and govern the actual individual organizations, chapters, or houses under them. So our IFC, which is our all of our men's fraternities, and what we would call historically white men's fraternity, and I'll talk a little bit about the differentiation between those a little bit later. But historically white men's fraternity, or IFC, those are typically what you will see on North Campus. If you went to North Campus, you saw many of the housing structures that had the Greek letters on them. Those are mostly our IFC, or all of our IFC fraternities here at Northwestern. Our Multicultural Greek Council, we have 6 of those organizations here, and they actually are a mixture of fraternities and sororities. And so these are all our, what we would call cultural-based fraternities and sororities. They typically will have a cultural or ethnic interest based on some type of identity. So we have Latinx fraternities and sororities, actually Latinx sororities, currently active in the group. We have some Asian fraternities and sororities, or sororities. And then we actually have some that are actually what they will describe themselves as multicultural. So they tend to take students who come from various different cultures. And so we also have our National Panhellenic Council. We have 6 of those chapters here. There are our historically African American, or historically black fraternities and sororities. They actually do consist of both fraternities and sororities as well. And then lastly, our Panhellenic Association, which is our 12 chapters. And you might have seen those groups who also have housing structures here on South Campus, over by Clark Street, or University Place and Emerson. And so those groups are our, what we would call our historically white sororities. And so I want to talk a little bit about those differences, particularly given that we have so many people who might not be involved. I want to talk a little bit, step back, and also talk about a little bit why I am describing them as such, right? So, it'll be real brief. I don't want to give a history lesson on fraternity and sororities, but we do want to acknowledge that a lot of these organizations became in existence out of resistance of the status quo, right? So obviously, when organizations were first started, fraternal organizations first started on college campuses, right? At some point, they were all white men, right? And so certainly sororities, women didn't have access to higher education, or wasn't allowed in the men's space, right? Obviously, they were very segregated back then, right? So in terms of gender or sex. And then of course our sororities came along, and then of course you didn't have access to higher education after women, of course people of color, and so you had an uprising of some of these organizations throughout history as different individuals got access to higher education. So that's why I would often describe them as historically white, historically black, and so forth. And so it also might be helpful to understand, as you might also see when our students come up, right, that students from various backgrounds can join any of these organizations, so they're not exclusive, but I do want to describe them in terms of their historical creation, right, or historical founding. And so feel free to ask any questions as we move forward as well, or particularly when we get to the Q&A as well. So pathway to joining, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. We can go into details about individual groups, but I want to give some big picture around what it means to join. Here at Northwestern, we do have deferred membership, which is a little bit different, I think, than deferred recruitment, particularly for some of our groups. So deferred membership, a student can't receive a bid or receive an invitation to join a fraternity or sorority until the winter quarter of their first year. And so although your student may or may not at this point be engaging with some activities that might be hosted by a fraternity or sorority, they can't technically join the organization until the winter quarter. And so for the most part, all of our different councils that I named earlier do them very differently in terms of how they go about recruitment. And so our ISC fraternities host various Sunday night dinners throughout the fall quarter. Your student may or may not have been involved in some of those already. Our Multicultural Breed Council and our National Panhellenic Council, they don't do a council-wide structure. They actually have their individual chapters hosting various programs. So your student may or may not have gone to some of those programs. They'll often host various programs, service activities, as well as what we call informationals for students to come and learn about those organizations or chapters. And then our Panhellenic Association actually will argue in rules the only group that does deferred recruitment. And so they typically will host a preview day though in the fall, or some type of activity for students to get to know what the community, the Panhellenic community is about, and that's actually coming up on November 17th. So your student may or may not be engaged in that. And then they actually go through a very formal structured recruitment process in the winter quarter. And so they actually have to register for that experience if they were interested. And registration is open now, and it is live, and so students can certainly register for that. And once we get back, I think January the 9th through the 14th is actually the formal recruitment for our Panhellenic sororities. And that's actually a formal recruitment where they're paired in groups and visiting each of the sorority houses. So please write down questions, and certainly can probe and ask questions, particularly as we get into the Q&A part. So we really enjoy, and we really thank our partners in NSFP, or New Student and Family Programs, for always thinking about how we can really partner with you all as partners in helping your student have a great experience, not only in a fraternity sorority, but in general as they're navigating the student experience here at Northwestern. And so certainly fraternity sororities are no different. We as an office really value the partnership we have with parents. And I can't tell you how much better it is to have you involved in this experience than it's not, right? So we want to really help you think about what's your role in what we see your role is as parents, right? We want you really to take an active interest, so you've really done that by being here today, which is great. And also we want you to do that by once you leave here, right? Speak to your student, and particularly if you know your student is interested in a fraternity or sorority, start having that conversation now around what are their interests, what do they like about the experience, helping them navigate. We also want students to join, although we do acknowledge these are social experiences. We want them to be able to have a conversation around what that means for them in terms of how they're going to engage the experience in a healthy, equitable, and responsible way, right? So we want you really to empower the students to ask questions of the chapters. I know on some campuses that is students sometimes, and I will also argue here as well, students sometimes feel that they can't ask questions because of they don't want to seem like they're asking a dumb question, quote unquote. But we really want students to feel empowered to ask questions. If they were anything like me, I was first generation college, I had no concept of what a fraternity sorority was, and so I really had to ask questions around what this experience offered. I know I saw groups of people hanging out together, and I was like, oh, I want to hang with the group, but I really didn't understand what it meant to be a part of a fraternity. So I had to really ask questions. So encourage you to ask questions, the chapters and their membership. We want you to encourage the students to keep an open mind as well. And so this is challenging here at Northwestern because we do the deferred membership. So students might have what they might perceive as an idea of where they want to join, but we really want them to keep an open mind. If they are interested in joining a sorority or fraternity, think about it as, I want to join a sorority and fraternity because of the experience that these organizations give, regardless of where that might be, right?
in terms of the house and or chapter. And so we really want students to keep an open mind throughout the entire process. Because all of our groups are great, right? I don't think you can really go wrong around where you join. All of our groups are doing really amazing work and good work here. So support your student in the transition to membership. So once they join, that's another hurdle, right? They will get their membership bid in the winter quarter if they're joining IFC and PHA, right? And then maybe sometime in the winter or spring quarter if they're joining our MPAC and MDC group. So know the difference in where they're joining and start talking about when they might be initiated as a member, right? Or once they might cross over or become a full member of the organization. So start asking those questions. Be involved in their process. Like if they're going through new member education, ask questions around what that experience is like for them, right? We want you to really be involved. And if you have some concerns, our office are always open to be able to engage and intercept where some concerns or further questions might be had for you also. So financial responsibility, we'll let also our individual students talk a little bit about this from their scope, from their vantage point, from their council. But for the most part, membership costs vary by organizations. It's very different for different groups. It is a lot of difference between the different councils, I would argue. It really matters whether an organization has a facility or residential or house part component of their membership as well. So it really will vary based on where your student might see their interest, and we'll have our students talk a little bit about that a little bit later. The university offers resources and support relative to student involvement. So we do have a fund that we will market to our students called the Student Activities Assistance Fund. And it's really to help students from low-income background or high need, particularly high financial need, to have access to join these organizations. Because many of these organizations are a financial commitment, and we do acknowledge that. But here at Northwestern, we want to make sure we break down that barrier. If a student really wants to be involved, we do have opportunity and assistance to be able to offer students of high financial need that might have a desire to join these organizations. Students should feel empowered to ask questions. We talked a little bit about that as well, but specifically about the financial responsibility. I can't tell you enough around how important it is to ask that question up front, because many times the students might join the organization but not really necessarily grasp the concept of the financial responsibility that it's going to take to remain an active member of the organization as well, right? And particularly when you're joining organizations that have housing facilities and that offer a meal plan that might have requirements around your membership to be involved in the house, but also on a meal plan. So those are things to ask questions about early and upfront, and as the parents and families, we ask you to do the same as your students making a decision on whether they want to join as well. So new education experience, we talked a little bit about that. I won't really go into it, but really the new education experience is supposed to be a really positive experience for your student, right? We really want them to start thinking about how we are orientating them to the organization. That's really what it's about. And so those programs will vary based on the organization, but anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks or 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the organization, might have. And some organizations actually don't do a new member education experience. Some of them actually will initiate or have your student be a full member at front, and then they do some kind of what we call new member trainings throughout the actual their first year of membership. And so it really depends on where your student might decide to join. We really also do take hazing serious here. We have a suite of resources for you. If you Google Northwestern hazing, there's a hazing repository website that has many different resources. Also for parents, how to ask questions that might get at some of this if your student is experiencing this. And so we really, really encourage students, but also parents to ask questions, and also notify the university if you have concerns, particularly around hazing. So. Academic support, one of the things we like to brag on about this experience is that our students who are affiliated with fraternity sororities actually do quite well academically. And so if we look at our data, particularly around grade point averages for students who are affiliated with fraternities and sororities, they typically are scoring in their grade point averages a little bit higher than students who are not affiliated. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are better students or better individuals, but I think there's something to be said about the experience that fraternity and sorority offers that really helps, I think, can help a student academically. And so some of that is really the mentorship and tutoring opportunities that we have. Many houses, and particularly many organizations that have some type of formal academic support structure, they may also require study hall or study time in their organizations, right? And so I think it's really something to be said about that experience for students. And it shows up particularly around when we look at our grade point averages across our student body here at Northwestern. And so we do have an honorary society within fraternity and sororities, as if we're not indeed already enough, right? Order of Omega is really an organization that really is recognizing students, the top 10% of our students who are doing well academically, as well as in leadership opportunities in the organization. And so we really use this organization to really kind of what we call highlight and recognize our students who are doing very well in the fraternity and sorority experience. So certainly leadership opportunities is another benefit, I think, of membership. So students, we actually looked at some survey data. We participated in a study, a multi-institutional study of leadership every 2 years here at Northwestern. And as we were looking at what we would call socially responsible leadership, which is a measure of that actual survey that we do, our fraternity and sorority students also do very well in this category in comparison to other students. This is also fresh information for me as well, because I just defended my dissertation a couple of weeks ago, and my dissertation was actually on leadership in fraternity and sorority nationally though. But nationally, we will see that students in fraternity and sorority experience really do well in what we would call socially responsible leadership. But it's the same here at Northwestern. I think even higher here at Northwestern. And I think it really speaks to, I think, the real opportunities we have for students to engage in self-governance, holding their peers accountable. Those are the things I think that you don't always get in some other student groups. And particularly for groups that have a housing component that are also living and cohabitating together, there's something to be said about that experience and how they're engaging with their peers and how it's really developing them to be a leader and be able to engage with their peers around particular topics. Risk management and wellness, we actually really stress this quite a bit here at Northwestern. So we engage with our student leaders around various topics throughout the academic year. So every month, our risk managers or associate chairs of every chapter are required to come in for a workshop, and we talk about various topics. And so those topics can range around alcohol and other drugs. They can be around sexual violence prevention. They also can be around bias and racism, right? We host, hazing is another topic as well. We host a suite of options for students to really engage, and we actually really require every chapter to engage in that education around that as well. I did mention around leadership. I talked about kind of the data, what the data says, but we also do some leadership programming in our office. So once a year, we actually do a retreat with all of our chapter presidents, where we go off on a day-long retreat to kind of talk about various topics and issues that might be relevant for their community, but also some self-reflection around who they are as individuals and how they might be prepared to lead their peers. We also do a retreat with our council executive officers. So you will see here we have our council presidents for the most part here, but we actually, all of our councils have about 6 or so officers that are elected democratically by their peers, right? And we actually do a retreat with those individuals as well every year at the beginning of their term. So a little bit about our staff. So we like to say here at Northwestern, we actually have a really good team that works with me rather, and that works with our students to think about what their experience has been like. We require all of our chapters to meet with our office at least twice a quarter. And so they're really checking in with us. We're checking in with them to make sure that the experiences continue to be what we would want to be socially just and responsible. Charles Andrew is our assistant director. Keith Garcia, we actually do have a vacant position that we'll be searching hopefully for soon. Charles advises our interfraternity council. I serve as the advisor for our National Penal Council. Keith Garcia advises our multicultural Greek council. And our vacant position is with our Panhellenic sorority, so we're looking forward to hosting that, to filling that role soon. But for the time being, Our chief graduate assistants have stepped up, I think, amazingly and helped support and fill in some of that gap with our vacant position. So Francesca Chavez actually is serving as our own co-penalty advisor, and then Samuel Silva. These are both Loyola University graduate students who are just up the road at Loyola but work on our campus part-time. So that's a little bit about chapters department and our staffing structure. So now what I want to do is invite our student leaders to come up and join us on the podium here. And so while they're doing that, I want to invite individuals in the audience that might have questions of me before we get into
Our student panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Any questions? Love it. Yeah.
How do you address Ripley's going forward versus what I might have read and of where Greek life is today?
So the question was really around the headlines we're seeing around Greek life and how do we reconcile, I understand the question, how do we reconcile, how we address those issues that might be talked about nationally, here locally, here at Northwestern. And so, as I mentioned, we are very, very transparent with around what might be happening in our community. So one of the things I want to also invite you all to do is on our Office of Student Conduct website, they actually will publish organizations that are currently under a status in terms of conduct. So if you Google Northwestern Student Conduct, their website will come up, and then they actually have a tab that has organizational conduct, and then on that tab is where our organizations that have a conduct status is listed. And so we invite parents and students to be looking at that, right? Because that tells you a lot about what organization you might be joining, right? If they have some type of conduct status. I think more specifically to answer your questions, I talked about the programming that we do that address some of the risk management and wellness. We know that we've seen in the news around particularly issues of alcohol abuse or death as it relates to alcohol. We really are working with our students and to be transparent around when those things happen nationally. How do we talk about that, particularly in the context of our campus? And so those monthly meetings we are having with our risk managers and associate chairs, the actual twice per quarter chapter president meetings we're having, we're actually talking about some of those issues, as well as our monthly chapter presidents meeting. I did name that we also meet with our chapter presidents as a group, as an entire group across the community once a month as well. And so we will name some of those issues that come up, and we talk very honestly and candidly around what that means for our campus community. And so, did that answer your question somewhat? Or did you want to have a follow-up question?
Well, I guess it's more of a concern in just polling 20-somethings that have had a Greek experience, not just at Northwestern, recent people in their 20s who've had Greek life. The males seem to say, especially on the East Coast, they can't see alcohol being removed from their social experience.
Yeah.
The females tend to say, oh, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
And but the males said, oh, I couldn't imagine my social experience without it. So that is what I'm
absolutely. And I would,
concerned about.
And I want to be transparent is that we have some of those challenges here, and I want to be very honest and upfront, right? We have challenges. I think anytime you engage with college students, there are going to be challenges around how they socialize. And so that's why we have a mission statement vision around talking to students around what we expect our fraternity and sorority experience to be. And when we hear those, we follow up with those immediately. One of the good things about here at Northwestern as well is that I think we operate very, very much in partnership with various colleagues on campus. And so although what I did mention is many of our residential facilities for fraternity and sororities, which is in times I think where we see a lot of the issues around how they are socializing and negative behaviors because of how they're cohabitating and living together. We do have staffing in those facilities that also is working with me to talk about what are some things they're seeing, right? And so when we hear of a concern that comes up, we pretty much address it pretty immediately. and try to call students in and talk about those situations. So we work very closely with the Office of Student Conduct, but not only from a punitive standpoint, we also work with our partners in CAPS, because sometimes that might be a driving force around how students are socializing if they're having mental health issues or some type of health issue. So we try to have a wraparound service in how we're working with students. But I will say that we as a university, and I think no university is immune to those concerns around how students behave. Prior to work at Northwestern, I worked at the University of Georgia, so a large southern state flagship school, and I think Greek life is situated very differently. What I can say from someone who's been doing this work for a number of years, and not to say we're absolved from that risk, is that students here at Northwestern, I think, engages very differently than what we would see sometime at a larger university, particularly that have large Greek systems or fraternity sorority communities. Some of the challenges we have at Northwestern, some of the good things we have about Northwestern is that our fraternity and sorority facilities are owned by the university. And sometimes at some of those other institutions, the facilities are privately owned by the fraternity and sorority. And so the university is a little bit more hands-off. We're a little bit more very hands-on with how we're working with the organizations in their chapter facilities, which I think sets us up from a little different dynamic, but still have those risk factors as well, and want to be transparent about what that is. Question in the back, and then we'll come here.
Do you have any instance that you could share with us of success in motivating the students to drink less, basically, or drink more responsibly? Is there anything that gives us a sense that there's been some success in?
Yeah. So I actually sit on our community alcohol coalition, and we actually have some data. I'm giving you all a bunch of websites to Google, but if you Google Community Alcohol Coalition for Northwestern, we have a big data set that we have interfaced where parents and any other external constituent can look at conversion rates for how students may be entering college, and then how they're converting towards their drinking behaviors, right? So a student might come in and be an abstainer, but then they might come in and be what we call high episodic drinker, right? Or vice versa, they might come in and be a heavy episodic drinker and then may start abstaining. Not many do that, but there's some conversion data around that. And so over the last few years, what we've seen is students, that conversion rate actually has gotten better in terms of how students may be coming in and then are going from abstainer or drinking less to heavy drinking. And we think some of that is around how we're socializing them with Wildcat Welcome. So when they come in for Wildcat Welcome, how we're socializing. We've been working very intently with our student leaders around making sure that particularly our fraternities, who often have historically been the social scene for new students that are coming in, to really give students opportunity to adjust and get acclimated to the campus experience before they start engaging in recruitment or events. And so we've seen that trend improve over the last few years. I'm naming that the piece around Wildcat Welcome is maybe a connection point, certainly not a causation, but could be some correlation. I think also is we're doing a lot of good marketing around social norming around alcohol, and so we know students are going to engage with it, but how do they engage with it healthy? One of the most recent campaigns we've had on campus is around one less drink. And so we want to have students to think about what it means to have just one less drink. So whatever you're drinking and how you're drinking now, think about what you would normally drink and think about, well, just take one less drink and see the difference that might have in how you're engaging socially on campus. And so we think that might be a positive correlation as well. So, but certainly take a look at the Community Alcohol Coalition Northwestern website, and it gives you a lot of good data around how students are engaging in alcohol on campus. We have a question here, and then we'll go to the question there, and then I want to give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll get back in the question and answer.
I think, so basically, I think listening to you, it looks like you have a lot of good programs for compliance, for education and all that. I think that sounds great. My question is, and I think maybe that will be a question for the panel, at the end of the day, what's happening in each of these sororities and the parties? How do you control that? It's great to have a program, but if you don't have an execution plan at the level, how do you manage that? How do you control that? Not the university compliance procedures, but on the ground. I'd like to maybe hear that from the panel. But that's really where is the whole monitoring thing comes in.
Right.
And also, from what I understand, the culture of these groups is such that, okay, if something's happening, people are afraid to raise their hand because it's not part of the wrong part of the group.
Yeah,
Really, I want to understand the details of how that is managed at that level.
absolutely,
Maybe you
absolutely.
can share some, but I think more.
And I certainly want.
Yeah, that would be great, yeah.
Yeah, and I certainly want to give the students opportunity. And that's why we have them here, right? Because what I told them is I'm not censoring them. I want them to really talk about their honest experience in these organizations, and I want to be able to have them to voice their opinions around this too as well. But that's a great question. I'm not at parties, right? They didn't hire me to be at parties to monitor parties. Certainly wish I had that amount of staff members to be able to do that, but we don't in theory, right? And so, yeah, we accept donations for staff positions if anybody want to donate for a monitor party monitor. But to answer your question, some of the things we're doing as a staff around management of social events is we do require our organizations to register those with our office. And what we try to do is not about approving their events. We really want to work with the social chairs and risk managers and or chapter presidents to think about, before the event happened, what are some things you can do to manage your event? So things like identifying sober monitors. We require them to have sober monitors, 1 per every 25 students that might be at an event. And some of the organizations might actually also have, most of them do have a party monitor, sober monitor ratio around how many sober individuals need to be at an event. So we want them to think about that, identify those students early on. And we also want them to think about the event space. So where is the event space being held? How are you monitoring people coming in and out of the event, right? How are you attracting people who's 21 and not 21? If you're hosting it at a venue, how can you rely on the venue also to help you manage some of those events? And we require them to submit that at least 10 days in advance, right? We want them to really think about, critically around how do I put things in place to have the event be successful. So that's one of the things we're doing, right? And I mentioned also around the risk management monthly workshops we're doing, right? We're doing that in hopes that they can take what they're learning from those workshops to apply them to social events, but also just general interactions in their facility. So those are some of the few things, but I certainly want to hear from them as individuals on the ground that are at the parties. And I attended parties 20, 30 years ago, and I know that's probably very different than how people are partying now, so I would love to hear kind of their honest opinion. So I'll let them answer that after her question, so that's great. You're good? Okay. So what I'll do first is allow them to first introduce themselves. And then the first question will be, I think, our question here around how do you see students show up, or how do you all see as leaders that being addressed in your particular council culture. So first introduce yourself, maybe talk about your name, say your name, what council or you're affiliated with, your position, maybe your chapter affiliation as well, your major, and then maybe why you joined Fraternity Sorority Life. That might be good as an introduction.
Hi, my name is Connor. My pronouns are he and his. I'm the president of the Interfraternity Council, which, as Travis mentioned, is the traditionally white fraternities, the ones that you see mostly on North Campus, but they are in some other places as well. I'm affiliated with Delta Tau Delta Fraternity, and why did I join Greek Life? I think it's a complicated question, but it probably centers mostly around community and self-growth, and the ability to make change around issues of inclusion and different forms of masculinity.
My name is Ruby. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am the president of Panhellenic, PHA, which is sort of what we call it here. My major is American Studies and History. I can't say my chapter affiliation because I'm disaffiliated for this quarter in preparation for recruitment in the winter. So all of our exec members and a group of about 50 recruitment counselors, we disaffiliate from our chapters and become sort of faces of the larger Panhellenic Council to help guide potential new members through the recruitment process. And sort of like your peer advisor, or if any of your students were first years or transfers, you have PAs or peer advisors to help them guide through the orientation process. That's how recruitment counselors work. And so our exec board also follows that. So I am disaffiliated. and why I joined. I never really heard about Greek life, and I had no idea what it was, but I got here and I was really attracted to a lot of the women that I was meeting, and like who were affiliated with chapters, and I really wanted, sort of Travis was talking about this, to like hang out with them, but also I wanted to find a community, because I think Northwestern is a place where if you can feel really lonely if you don't sort of like, it feels like you need to like have this official group, and that's not true, you don't need that, but I think I was looking for that as a freshman.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm a senior here, majoring in social policy, double minoring in African American Studies and business. I'm the president of the National Panhellenic Council, which, as Travis said earlier, is the historically Black Greek Council in Northwestern. Specifically, I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and why I decided to become Greek. Actually, funny story, when I came into college, I thought I was pretty adamant about not wanting to be Greek because what I knew of Greek life was what I saw on TV, which was a lot of partying, a lot of drinking, a lot of getting into trouble, and I just wasn't really interested in that. And also, from what I saw on TV, a lot of the Greek life that I saw was mainly like historically white organizations, not a lot of Black Greek life. But once I got on campus, I saw that I saw predominantly Black organizations, saw what they were about, specifically women in my sorority. They hold a lot of leadership positions. They're about service. They're very passionate about helping the community. They're passionate about helping people. And I related to their passion, and that made me want to pursue Delta. And so, I pursued it, and obviously I'm here. So, yeah.
Hello, I'm Yuri. I'm a senior. I'm studying sociology, minor in legal studies. I am the vice president of the Multicultural Greek Council, and our council holds like a lot of like cultural and identity-based sororities and fraternities. I feel like same like Erica. I also had a perception of what Greek life was until I got to Northwestern, and I like found out that there were these multicultural ones. Specifically, I met with my sorority, which is Lambda Theta Alpha Latin Sorority Incorporated, which was the first Latina sorority established. I really like got to know them, and then got to see what they're about, all about like the cultural aspect, academics, and like really like trying to like make like my identity like on campus comfortable. So that's really why I joined.
So I think the question was to talk about how, in your experience, particularly in your council, how do you all go about managing events? What are they like actually? Legitimately, what are they like to be at, and how do you all manage kind of safety and promote safety at them? So, if I got correctly what you were asking.
Cool, yeah, so like I said, I am the IFC president, so that's mostly those houses on North Campus, and generally, before I get into how we handle risk management, a lot of events, a lot of parties will happen in those houses on North Campus, or in off-campus houses, as you may have seen with like tailgates and things like that, as well as in bars in the community or in Chicago, usually later in the quarter. So in terms of our risk management policies, we have supplemental things in addition to what the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Life does, mandating a certain number of sober monitors during events. I would say in general, that is a pretty successful policy. We make sure, we verify before events that there are an appropriate number of sober monitors. We have different policies around alcohol and making sure that there are like safe drinking habits, safe pouring habits for people that are bartenders and things like that. And then also making sure that people are able to identify sober monitors during events so as to be able to engage with them if there's an issue that they're facing. I think that's a good kind of summary.
I'm also the president, I think that I made this clear, of the historically white sororities. And that's also, we have a lot of social connections with IFC. So I think we follow the similar plan beyond FSL sort of regulations. So every chapter for any event, whether it's like a mixer or anything, has to have a specific amount of sober monitors. We also sort of like, I think that these discussions, particularly in the wake of like national Greek life headlines about sexual assault, we've been having a lot of, and Me Too and everything. I think there's been like sort of a larger conversation about how to like protect your sisters and sort of like what sober monitoring goes beyond just like taking care of drunk people. Like it's about sort of looking out for the interactions between men and women, and so we've been trying and sort of like watching people and going behind like the bar to see how the drinks are being made and like what the alcohol content could be, and you know what alcohol is being used and things like that, and how much like people are being influenced to drink or not. So we've been having like, we lead programming. Basically every chapter is required to have like PHA programming as well beyond FSL programming, and we lead workshops about like harm reduction in terms of like a party setting, and also that gets into larger conversations about like I think the people in my community just like to have those conversations because we're in college and it's like a national conversation about these sort of like smaller interactions between men and women, and when alcohol is at play, and sort of like how that influences those interactions. And yeah.
I think I can talk quickly first about, I guess, my organization and also like the council. So I feel that, at least in my experience, sororities in PhD don't really even throw parties. We tend to be the ones who are like more about events, activities, social service, things like that, educational events, like educating the community on things like drug and alcohol usage, on sexual health, on things like that. And fraternities are more the ones that throw parties, but I feel that they also are pretty, I guess, cognizant of what is going on at the parties, because as NPHC representatives and as, you know, the country is looking at, you know, these Black people who are kind of, you know, also affiliated with Greek, there is a certain perception, so we're very mindful of how we're being perceived because of, you know, being Black and being Greek, which can sometimes be kind of double negative. So, yeah.
For MGC, I would say the story is kind of like along the same, where like our organizations like usually nationally aren't allowed to hold like official events that have alcohol, but that doesn't mean that things don't happen. That more so means that like if parties are thrown, they're more like in an informal setting, because like nationally you can't affiliate like your like chapter like with a public event with alcohol. So with that, our council like really tries to like emphasize like individual like trainings from each chapter for like Red Watch Band training, which is like where students go and are taught by other students about like what to look out for when it comes to like alcohol and other like substance use. So we have to take more like an individual approach and just encourage our chapters to like follow like the Northwestern like policies and procedures around like different like things that have to do with like alcohol consumption.
And could I also add, you know, I love the dynamic we saw maybe as we went down the line. I think, and I think Erica and Yuri mentioned this, I think it is different in MPHC and MGC, a little bit around nationally how they are interacting, but I also think there are some groups that do throw parties in those councils, but it's also about, I think, the capital that some of those groups have. They're smaller groups. They tend to not throw the bigger parties that you will see sometimes because of the capacity that IRC and PHA are able to do because of their size and access to capital and financial resources. So that I want to nuance that a little bit, because you know I always try to challenge our MPHC and MGC. Y'all are engaging with alcohol, but it's just very different, and it might be in a different level per se. So not to bash my MPHC and MGC people. Y'all know I love you. I am UPHC affiliated as well, so I just wanted to name that. Also, I wanted to name, particularly around alcohol, another university policy that we hope that we have seen that have driven culture around alcohol, and particularly, we have a amnesty policy here at Northwestern. What we saw a few years ago before implementing the policy is that students who might engage with alcohol very negatively and was in a situation where they needed assistance were questioning whether to call for help. We saw what happened if you are in tune with the headlines, and not to name them, but Penn State is, I think, is an example that is something that's happened that's been very nationally recognized. And in that incident, we had a situation where a student had engaged with alcohol, but the students that were around him did not call for help because they were concerned about the repercussions of their engaging with alcohol. And so, not only Northwestern, but I think institutions have begun to think about how do we create an atmosphere where students feel that they can call for assistance if they need to. And so we do have an amnesty policy if students do call for help if they're in a situation with alcohol, and we do provide amnesty for them in terms of disciplinary status. That we will require them to come in and meet with the office, with us as an institution, particularly our Office of Student Conduct, who manages that caseload. And they might require some educational opportunities to really talk with the student around, well, what happened, is there an issue you have with alcohol that we need to think about? But from a conduct status standpoint, we do provide amnesty, so they don't have to worry about being suspended or on probation because they engage in alcohol. But we do follow up with them. And we often get many referrals that when students are in a situation with alcohol, we work very closely with our City of Evanston Police, our hospitals. I serve in our Dean on Call rotation, and so many times we'll get calls from the city police around a student that might have been transported, and then we do some follow-up pretty immediately with that student. Actually, the night of, but also the next day and coming days as we're thinking about follow-up around conduct of that student. So I wanted to name that as well. Any other questions? It sounds like you had a follow-up question. I want to give you, and then we'll go back to here. But you got a follow-up question around that?
Yeah, so I think I got two things. One is for the panel and then for you. The panel is, I'd like to understand a little bit, outside of the students' regular curriculum, studies, activities, approximately how many hours a week are they expected to be part of the group and perform activities? That's a question for them. And follow-up question again regarding this alcoholism and stuff. See, you keep hearing about that alcoholism is a problem. You've got all these procedures in place, but is there any policy or procedure? How do you control underage drinking? Because it's a law that underage drinking is not allowed, but also what I hear is common practice that happens in universities. So is it like a normal thing that you let it happen? Why is it happening for underage drinking? Why can't that be controlled?
I will say we do not condone it. So if in a situation where a student might be engaging in underage drinking, they do go through the conduct process, right? So we will follow up with them if they are breaking state laws or university policy. Our university policy is that we don't allow underage drinking. We do not condone it. We're not going to set a policy that is contradictory to state and or federal laws, right? So I would say that. I also think that students, when a student is transitioning from high school to college, there's some level of independence that they're gaining, right? And so students are going to be making some decisions. I think that's incumbent on us as a university, as staff members and faculty, to be engaging in discussion around with them. I hope also that you all as families and parents are engaging in conversations around the students. So we don't allow it, but I think sometimes our students make decisions that we then have to follow up on and have a conversation around why they made those decisions or what else is going on that impeded your ability not to do that or to make a decision to do that. So anybody want to say anything to that here before we go to the next question? Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think yes, underage drinking is illegal, but I was also gonna say that I think at least in the country, the way that college is sort of like conceived in, you know, our minds as this like greatest 4 years of your life, like kind of mindset, and I don't necessarily think that's true. But I also think that that students anyways, Travis kind of said this, are going to make their own decisions, but like this is the first time that they're going to be exposed to that, like no matter what, they're for sure going to be exposed to alcohol, whether it's underage or at the age of 21. And I think like the university doesn't condone it, but like it's happening anyways. And that's true for any college. And it's certainly exacerbated in Greek life because of, but there's also, it's not the basis of Greek life, I believe.
Also, to add on to that, I also agree, like there is this perception of like in college, this is your time to like make mistakes and to, you know, live your best life, because once you graduate, you're an adult and you really have to focus on your career and things like that. And I also think, like, I think Northwestern is doing, you know, a pretty good job is trying to like regulate this, you know, alcohol problem. But, you know, like I said, it's just a nationwide thing that drinking is cool, it's what happens at colleges. And it's a really hard problem to solve because it's something ingrained, not just within Northwestern students or just within college students, but just within people in general. And like Northwestern could make a rule, they could completely ban like alcohol from campus, period. Like even Greek life, each council can make a rule that says no like organizations can host parties with alcohol, and each chapter, individual chapter can do that as well. But even then, I don't think that will really solve the problem, because as individuals, like individual students, they want to consume alcohol, and that's, you know, that's their own, I guess, not right because it's legal, but their choice and it's their own personal desire. And I feel like just preaching, like just it's illegal, don't do it, won't really solve the problem, because obviously it hasn't been solved and it's something that's been going on for decades. So I think mostly what we should be doing is focusing on education and focusing on responsible consumption of alcohol. What are the risks that you can face if you consume alcohol, like things of that nature. So I think that's what will really help students nowadays.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something? Yeah. I think like in addition to that, I would say like remembering, like I know I'm a senior, but 3 years ago as a freshman when I first got here, I just remember that Northwestern did kind of take like those extra steps to prepare me for that exposure to alcohol, whether it was like through T&Ds, which were like kind of like these sessions that freshmen have to attend that educate them on like alcohol use and other substances like use. So, I also remember that they would like talk about the amnesty like policy like very often. So, because Greek life isn't the only place where alcohol is exposed, it'll be exposed in almost any kind of like group organization, because that's the social component of also joining any kind of student group where they do have like informal parties and things like that. So I think regardless, it is going to happen. It's just like Northwestern does like take like extra steps to like prepare students on like what could happen if one of your friends drinks a little bit too much, or like what to do if like you're feeling a little peer pressure, like how to like kind of like be prepared for like those kind of situations. And then yeah, at the end of the day, it does come down to like an individual's choice.
And I also want to name, we've talked a lot about alcohol, but the majority of our students don't drink. Like it's not, we're talking about it as if people are just like around here partying and they're just like turning it up. But you know, the majority of our students do not engage with alcohol, and you'll see that on that data dashboard that you referred to the Community Alcohol Coalition. But we also want to make sure that students who are engaging with it, that they know the rules and federal laws around it, that they're engaging with it in healthy ways, right? Many of our students are 21 and they are allowed to drink, and so what it means for you to engage with it. I also think it's a culture thing too. So there's a culture that comes around with this as well that I think is evident even from my upbringing, right? My interactions with alcohol might be very different with my peer, right? And how they might engage with it. I also think there's a culture in fraternity sororities that might sometimes challenge students around that as well, that I want to be explicit around acknowledging. particularly as we talk about the differences in the different fraternity and sorority types, sometimes might encourage that too. So, but I do want to make sure that people know that everybody's not drinking. All of our students are not drinking here at Northwestern. Question here, yep. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that the cost of being in a fraternity or sorority varies from program to program. In general, how does it compare to the price of official university housing and dining?
Talk about it.
Yeah. Also, you asked a question as well about time per week. I just wanted to note that real quick. It varies a lot by chapter. It's going to be a little bit more usually in that first quarter that you join, or if you choose to take on a leadership position. I obviously spend more time per week than most other people do, engaged in like Greek life-oriented activities as an executive officer of the council. But minimum, I would say, once you've joined, probably around 2 to 3 hours, with the maximum being in leadership roles. It can be a part-time job, basically. As for cost of housing, so for IFC chapters, that definitely also varies by house. You could have generally pretty comparable to university housing, depending on what kind of room you're going to get. If you want to have a single room, that's going to be more expensive, just like it would be in university housing. If you want to live in a triple, that's going to be cheaper. So, but about the same costs, with added benefits of kind of basically having that space for the community and also having usually food in-house for the fraternities on North Campus, the IFC fraternities.
In terms of housing for PHA, I think it is relatively cheaper than the university housing, but like by, I would like not very little. But I think also the university just instituted this 2-year live-on requirement, so that sort of, I think has been a pull for some students to live in their second year because, and we sororities also have houses, but that's been the pull for students to live in because that counts as living on campus for the second year, and if they don't want to live in a dorm. And also a lot of people, like I personally lived in my house, and it was like one of my most favorite years of college. But yes, the financial, I think also some houses institute 2-year living requirements, so you also might have to live up for sophomore and junior year, which has also been something that happens.
And they did mention the 2-year living requirement. So a first-year student, so now at Northwestern starting this year was the first year that second years needed to live on campus. And so the fraternity and sorority house does count towards that second-year living requirement. So you would join ideally at some point during your first year, and then your second year, you do have to live on campus as well. And if you're in a fraternity or sorority, you can live in the house. It meets that second-year living requirement. I think very generally they talked about it being a slightly cheaper, and I do want to indicate slightly, right? There's slightly cheaper, and it also depends on the house too. Some houses have meal plans that might be a little bit more robust, and so that's something to be cognizant of and ask questions around and how you might supplement, because some houses might offer lunch and dinner for 5 days a week, for instance. And so you just think about what those other meals are and how do you supplement those or have supplementation for those meals. And so if you're in that house, it might be a little bit cheaper because they're not giving you as many amenities. Whereas I know for particularly one of our sororities I'm thinking about, they offer 3 hot meals a day for 7 days a week, right? So that's a little bit different than what they might be offering. And so some questions to ask. I've got a question here and then we'll go in the back.
Hi, you mentioned probation and suspension, and I'm curious, number one, what happens when a chapter is on probation or suspension? And number 2, are there chapters that are currently on probation or suspension, or is there a list where that would be observed? How would people know?
To answer the last question is yes. If you, I think I mentioned earlier, if you Google student conduct at Northwestern, on our student conduct website is a tab that has organizational conduct. You can look and see which organization, not only fraternity, sorority, but any student group at Northwestern and their conduct status. To answer your question around where the current status of groups, we do have one of our MGC fraternities that are suspended currently. Pi Alpha Phi, they should be on the website as well. And in terms of probation, none of our groups currently on probation. We do have a few that might be on a conduct review. So we have different levels of disciplinary status. So conduct review might be a very low level violation. We just letting them know, like, you're on a review, you might have some sanctions that you might have to turn into the Office of Student Conduct. Probation, meaning that this is a little bit more serious. If you had another violation, you would then likely be suspended, right? And so that's kind of the layers of the conduct status. There's a couple of groups on conduct review. I don't know right off the top of my head, but if you go on that website, they're certainly on there. But suspension, obviously, I would know a suspension because obviously that means that it was a little bit more higher profile, and one of our MGC fraternities was suspended, and particularly around their engagement with alcohol, actually. And so, so that's why I challenged a little bit around when they were talking about MGC and MPAC. I didn't want to give you the impression that alcohol is not happening at MGC and MPAC, because it is. It just might be a little bit different and at a different pace, because we do have an MGC fraternity, in particular, one of our only Asian interest fraternity was suspended last year for alcohol.
So lots of different events that are usually some kind of pun about the chapter's name and some food or things like that, or different community service things like working with, ranging from working with like young people in the Evanston community to ecological things, so just depending on the chapter's interest, and so that varies a lot. And in addition to that, usually there's a lot of, so in a lot of IFC chapters they'll refer to them as brotherhood events, which can be a wide range of things, from things that do involve drinking to other ones where it's more about like different like dialogues, conversations around identity, or different things like movie nights, things like that, ways to build engagement with the community and help people build relationships between each other.
Yeah, every chapter of the 12 chapters has their own philanthropy, and they're like attached to a larger organization, and they have to put on specific events. Some of them required by nationals, and some of them just like that they personally wanted to do. So that can range from like a flea market to a food thing to anything. And those are really fun and a great sort of like leadership opportunity for officers. But also then we do have a lot of like, I think also living in the house is a huge part of that, but like a lot of like, we did a pumpkin carving event that are just like personal things that you do with other chapter members. Yeah.
Specifically about my chapter, so we actually don't identify ourselves as a social organization. We identify as a service organization, and Delta has a 5-point programmatic thrust, and each event usually revolves around one of those thrusts, which involves either economic development, education development, international awareness and involvement, political awareness involvement, or physical and mental health. And so earlier this quarter, we had our Regional Day of Service, where each Delta chapter in the Midwest had a day of service where we did something. My chapter did a clean up the highway project, as well as a food pantry organization project. We've done a gym event to promote physical health and cardiac health. We did a flyer pass out of breast self-examinations for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Also, every year we have an annual May Week, which each day of the week revolves around one of those thrusts that I mentioned, and then we end with our Jab Walk Scholarship Ball, which is to support and showcase Northwestern students' talents and, kind of be a center for student engagement, as well as we award 1 to 2 graduating high school seniors with a scholarship as they're pursuing college and help them, a little bit at least. So yeah, we do try to just promote community engagement of Northwestern students, as well as just service.
I would say for Multicultural Greek Council, since we do have about 6 active organizations right now, for the most part, you could say that all of our chapters do either cultural events, they'll do professional development, educational, philanthropy events, or service events. So those are kind of like the array of like events that like our chapters have. I can speak more on behalf of mine, where we do like also community activism. We host events like just like an educational component with like food, or like people will be fundraising for their specific philanthropy, or like they'll host actual service events. Like there's one of our fraternities hosts like a national like event, which is like their Cesar Chavez Day of Service, where like a lot of people sign up and like they just go out to the community and do like different service events. So that's really what our like organizations like try to do.
Another question here, and then we'll go ahead.
If my daughter wants to join the sorority, what type of question she needs to ask to find out which sorority is the best for her interest?
So the question was if her student wanted to join a sorority, or a sorority in this case, what type of questions should she be asking? I think that's a really thoughtful question, I think. And so for me, this is not exhaustive, but I think a couple of questions I would ask, and certainly I'll pass it over to the students to get their perspective, is one around who are you all as an organization, right? I would want to know from an organization, this is my 37-year-old brain now, probably not the question I asked when I was 18. But who are you all, and what do you all stand for as an organization? What do you all value? What would you say you all value as an organization? I would want to know that, because I would want to know if their organization matches what I'm truly passionate about. We've heard from some of the students that talk about some of the service and philanthropy events that they do. I think that tells a lot, and I'm always an advocate, and you all have probably heard this saying before, is you know the value of people around where they spend their money. And so I would want to know, like, what is your chapter doing programmatically? Where do you spend most of your budget doing? That maybe give you some context around who they are as an organization. Two is, I would want to know the financial commitment too, right? Because that's a pretty tangible question and ask, so you can know how much it costs to be a member of the group. And then what are some of the expectations you all have of members? So once I join, or if I am a part of the organization, what are some of those expectations you all might have as a member of the organization? So those are just three, but certainly not exhaustive. I could rattle out a whole host of questions, and we'll certainly, could be available to answer those questions or give some more guidance a little bit later. I do want to pass over to students to get their perspective on maybe some I didn't name. If y'all have anything, you don't have to have anything, but if you.
I was just gonna say, so like the way at least for BHA, the recruitment process works is that everybody, all the PNMs, which stands for potential new members, have conversations with women from each of the chapters through like various sets. So there's set 1, set 2, set 3. And it's like probably one of the most like formal structured recruitment processes of the 4. And there's sort of like this myth that you're not supposed to talk about these like 5 Bs, which are like boys, ballots, booze, Bible, and I forget the last one, but they're dumb. And the point is that sort of this like notion that you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion and boys and alcohol. And boys and alcohol are different because they ultimately don't matter. But the things about religion and politics we actually are encouraging potential new members to talk about those because those are things that like define who you are. And if you're looking for friends, obviously you want to find people who also, bank, that's the last one, bank for financial stuff. Yes, also important. Those are like sort of the things that define you and are defining, how you want to be on this campus. So we had a girl who kept kosher, and she was like, I need to know, what the food is like here, and that's important to me. We had a girl who was Muslim, and she was like, I need to know if there's sort of anti-Palestine sentiment in this chapter. And those are things that like I would definitely encourage, like if those are important to your values. I think like straying away from religion and politics is like not ever would I want someone to come away from the recruitment process or go into the recruitment process thinking that they shouldn't ask about. And we're doing a really big push this year for all active members to like memorize their dues, so that we want every single person to be able to answer the financial commitment of their chapter when asked, since that's sort of like one of the most important things, and we don't want anyone to sort of get into a chapter that they can't manage financially.
Oh, question here, so you have a question.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to the person who asked in the back, and the only one who didn't answer the question was the man in the end of the IFC of underage drinking. It seemed like a lot of the things were coming from the perspective of the underage drinkers self-managing and being educated, and in the Penn Clinic, it was the education of all sorts of things, but from your perspective in the IFC of what part do you take in the responsibility as an organization of underage drinking and making it available and normalizing excessive drinking or underage drinking? How do you view that as with your chapters?
I'm just trying to make sure, I'm just thinking through the question to make sure that I answer it well. But yeah, I think that is a genuine, very substantial issue in terms of we are organizations that, of all of the ones up here, our chapters do the most around providing alcohol, do the most around stuff like that, and that can be a real challenge, especially from my perspective as someone who, I'm at the IFC level, so I don't necessarily control how each chapter is making decisions, but I can hopefully try to like fight back against drinking culture issues. So half of that is, like other people have mentioned, a lot of that has to do with trainings and different opportunities to bring in outside voices from the administration, who provides a lot of different opportunities. As we mentioned, things like Red Watch Band, different things like that to help engage with those issues, as well as making sure that people are complying with things like conduct sanctions around education and things like that to regulate drinking culture, as well as finding opportunities to have deeper conversations about the underlying things like masculinity that we'll often see as drivers of these different issues, especially around binge drinking and things like that. If there's a lot of toxic masculinity in the community, if there's a lot of things that we're doing there, it's going to encourage drinking, and it's going to end up with people having a lot more instances of that. One more concrete thing that we've done more recently was working with the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Life to really crack down on things during Wildcat Welcome Week, with the intention of having a different introduction to the community and hopefully changing the culture to the extent that the way that you're involved with IFC fraternities for the first time is not through drinking, and that is hopefully something that we can do to begin, and I want to highlight begin, this process of changing the culture around alcohol, because it is true that we are large providers of alcohol.
I'll also add to that, I think one of the things our IFC exec board does Thursday, Friday, Saturday, is they do rounds in the North Quad. And so they're often, they have a round schedule that they set up every week that they go and do rounds to try to make sure that they are being proactive around addressing issues that might arise in the community. And they will make referrals to the Office of Student Conduct as necessary as well. So I'd be able to add that to the piece. I think one of the things that I want to speak of, I think Connor's leadership in IFC, Connor came to IFC, I think, around, I would argue, around a platform around having honest dialogue around, particularly the issue around masculinity, how that's showing up in our community, particularly the IFC community, in unhealthy ways, right? So I would argue that his platform has been mostly around having the chapters really engage in dialogue around masculinity, how that might be showing up in things like alcohol, sexual misconduct. And so I think he has done, or particularly his administration has done a good job in really centering that conversation in the community. And I hope that there'll be more to come after his leadership. So,
I have a similar question for the sororities in terms of, I'm sure it varies, but in general, how many people are in a sorority, and then how many are in the sorority house?
For PHA at least, I think in all the sororities, there is like a pledge class. It is varies, but there's about, I would say like count it at like 40 per pledge class. So those 4 pledge classes, 40 times 4 is that number, 160. And there's about 12 chapters. And so basically, I think it's like an 1,000-person community. And in the house though, normally only 2 pledge classes live in, or 1 and like a half a pledge class. Different houses can fit different people, and trying to fill the house is sort of a longer thing. And but I would say like some houses can fit 50, and some houses can fit like 30. But normally you have about like 40, 45, maybe less girls living in the house.
Yeah, there's a few more beds in our sorority, PHA sorority houses than it is in the fraternity, IFC fraternity spaces. But for the most part, I would echo what they're saying. Roughly, particularly if you're a new member and you join, typically your sophomore year, your second year, you're living in the house. And then some groups will have a 2-year live-on requirement, so your junior year you would also live in the house if that group offered new members. I wanted to also give some perspective on our NPC and MGC sororities and fraternities. So membership average, I think it really varies depending on the sorority, but the sizes of those groups are much smaller. They tend to be on average around 10 to 15 members, so a smaller group and more of a close-knit group. And oftentimes they join, many of them sometimes will join as sophomores or juniors, and so you'll see them oftentimes, maybe sometimes living off campus together in off-campus spaces. So. We have time for 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
What's the deadline for application?
Deadline for applications? So it really will depend on the group. I think right now we have an application live currently for PHA recruitment, and I'll allow Ruby to maybe talk about deadline for PHA recruitment if there is one.
It's not so much an application as you register to go through the process, and right now the registration is open, and then it'll be open basically until the end of winter break, and then we start recruitment the week we get back. So it's from January 9th to 14th, and then by the end of that process, the person will get a bid or will not, but it's very unlikely that someone's released. That really doesn't happen a lot. So it's not, so basically you have to pay $35 to register now, $50 after the 17th, because that's when we have our preview info session, November 17th, and you register, and there's no real application yet.
Question in the back.
Have you seen any parental behaviors which promote underage drinking, or which prevent underage drinking?
Have we seen what behavior?
Parental behaviors.
Parental behaviors? Interesting, that's a good question. Short answer will be yes. I think oftentimes, this is just based on conversations I've had with students through the years doing this work. Certainly if parents are engaging in behaviors that might be influential in their child behavior, right, we see that sometimes. I've unfortunately have been in situations where parents are drinking with the student, right? I don't say unfortunate because I think that's cultural, right? I think I'm projecting my cultural piece because my dad always would tell me he would never drink with me, but I know that in some instance that is okay, right? But I think the parental culture around how parents are educating their child around alcohol certainly is an influence, and I've seen students talk about that, unfortunately, around they might have had a parent that had a negative interaction or a negative relationship with alcohol, and they're perceiving that that is why they might be behaving the way they are, at least in how they're naming. So yes, short answer, yes, I've seen that. I don't know if anybody else want to add anything to that piece. Okay. So we have time for maybe one more question and then we'll wrap it up. if there's one. All right.
Is there any drug issues in sorority or fraternity?
Is there any
Drug.
drugs? Gotcha. Yes, for short answer, I think there's drugs on any college campus. What I would say though is we're not seeing that disproportionately in fraternity and sorority spaces that we're seeing in general students and how they are interacting. If that kind of gives you some sense of maybe how drugs. One of the things we are talking about, and one of the things I think you all as parents, it might be helpful for you to know, and particularly around drugs, is the state of Illinois passing marijuana as recreational. That's something that we're talking about as a campus community, and to think about how we are educating students around that. So although the state of Illinois has passed a law to legalize recreational use of marijuana, institutions of higher education, college and university, is still illegal to engage in those drugs on campus. And so that's a distinction we really want to get out in front of. And so if you can have an honest conversation with your students around that, make sure that they know that. We're going to do a lot of messaging around that. Our dean of students, I know, are going to be sending out some messaging around that, particularly as we come closer to January 1st. So when they come back in the winter quarter, it will be recreationally legal in the state of Illinois, but they still can't engage in that in the residence hall or in their fraternity sorority house or even on campus anywhere. And so I just wanted to name that. But short answer, that I feel that yes, there's drugs on college campuses, but I wouldn't say that they're disproportionately in the fraternity sorority spaces. I think one of the things that we are having conversations around with drugs or other substances is stimulants. So a lot of students might take Adderall around trying to stay up at night. And so we are having conversations with students and educational conversations with students around how do you not abuse that, right? If you're taking stimulants to help you study and you're trying to pull all-nighters, let's have some conversation around how you engage in healthier behaviors around trying to perform academically. Sometimes I think, particularly at a school like Northwestern, I have seen that show up a lot more here than at other places I've been at, around students trying to study. I mean, they're literally pulling all-nighters. This place moves very fast, it's quarters, and so students are really trying to take stimulants to help keep them alert to study. And it's around how to, talking to them about how do you better manage your time around studying instead of trying to pull all-nighters. So I hope that answers your question. Well, thank you all. I know we're at noon now. I really appreciate it. We'll be up front at the end, so feel free to come down and ask questions. Thank you so much for coming today. We hope that if your student is choosing to join the experience, that you will continue to be a good partner with us as we go on that journey. And certainly we're here to answer any questions at the end of the day. Thank you all, and we hope you have safe travels back to your destination.